Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 9 of English 100B. Again, these reminders, I think you'll agree with me that you need them when you get test results back today. First of all, you should be making and adding onto a grammar review cassette tape. Truly, you should listen to it at least one time a day. That's the way you're going to reinforce this material for life. You should be using the online grammar tutorial to supplement any class presentations you're weak on. Remember that the grammar URL is grammar.dianzacollege.org, and do refer to listserv memos for due dates on current assignments. Well, today we have a lot of things to cover, and I'm at least hoping that we cover all of them. Basically, we're going to focus on the complex sentence and fragment errors, and we'll go back to exercise 6, which we had started the other day on 135 to 142, practice in locating subjects and verbs in complex sentences, and as soon as we finish that, you're ready for an exam. Then we're going to move toward a discussion on fragments in the Palette book, pages 143 to 145, and we're going to talk about the difference between a clause and a phrase, and the difference between a prepositional phrase and a verbal phrase. And then we'll go back through pages 147 to 149 and talk about specifically the infinitive construction and an infinitive phrase fragment. Also, how to eliminate that particular kind of a fragment, and how to recognize the fact that sometimes an infinitive phrase acts as a noun modifier or even as the subject of a clause. Again, there are examples in the textbook for us to look at. Then we'll move on in the Palette book through pages 151, 159, and we'll talk about defining the present and the past participle phrases. And we'll talk about how you recognize a present participle phrase fragment and a past participle phrase fragment. We'll talk about how you eliminate that particular kind of a fragment error. And then we're going to switch gears, maybe not in this order, and talk about the grading scale and correction symbols that apply to quiz number 1 on the simple sentence. And we're going to analyze sample sentences from that particular quiz. We will go back to the Palette book again, and we'll talk about words that end in ing that are not necessarily verbs. They can act as a noun and even as a noun modifier. And we'll learn how to determine the tense of a clause. Then we'll look at flip-flop patterns in phrasing that will be clear to you once we get those half verbs sorted out. So on pages 161, 162, we'll look at examples and see how a prepositional phrase, for example, can start with a preposition but end with a verb phrase object. And finally, we're going to look in the Palette book on pages 163 to 164 and learn how to make and use a verb chart. In terms of written assignments, I'm going to go over instructions with you on how to fill out the cover sheet for quiz number 2 on the complex sentence. And I'm also going to ask you to do in the Palette book on page 163, exercise 7, which has you making a verb chart for your personal use. And again, I remind you to refer to listserv memos for information to put on the cover sheet for quiz number 2 and also for due dates for all current assignments. Well, you remember that we were talking about exercise 6 when we stopped, and we were looking basically at pages 135 to 142 where you got practice locating subjects and verbs in complex sentences. And to go over the directions with you very briefly, we said that in each sentence you should underline the subject with 1 line and the verb with 2 lines, and that will be in both your main and your dependent clauses. You should be on the lookout for things like an implied subordinate, and also remember to recognize that 4 of the words on the subordinate connective list, that, what, which, and who, can be pronouns as well as subordinate connectives, so sometimes they do double function as both the subject and the subordinate in a dependent clause. You'll want practice circling the subordinate connectives and writing them down in the blank spaces that appear to the right. And I'm just going to review 2 of the examples that we talked about before we started this whole assignment to remind you that we're now looking at Susan Vreeland's book, Girl in Hyacinth Blue, and that, as I said on the example, partway through the journey, you're going to need to stop and read the book yourself to uncover the final decades and see why a young scholar gives up a newborn son, why Vermeer decides to paint his daughter, and why Magdalena is fascinated by rounds of cheese that are sold, I think we didn't even talk about that dependent clause, in Market Square. So we had there a main clause, we had 4 dependent clauses, it gave us a complex sentence. And I told you as we go through this, you should practice making vertical columns of the subordinate connectives that are represented. So it would be Y, and it would be Y, and it would be Y, and then it would be that. This last clause that we didn't talk about is right there. Well, then remember that we took a look, and we're going to take a different look at a different cheese stall near Market Square, that this is what we're talking about with Magdalena at the end of the story and what she has to do with cheese stalls and an interest in cheese anyway. And here's another view of these gorgeous cheese stalls that appear twice a week in Delft, this one on the Saturday market day. Well, in terms of instructions for this exercise, I asked you to track your clauses, as you will do on the test on the complex sentence. I asked you to do a progressive drawing and a clause tabulation to make sure that you have the right number and type of clauses to form a complex sentence, abbreviated CX. And you do need to run a punctuation check on each example that you write. Well, we had started out by looking at a couple of sentences, chapter 1 of the book, that talked about this German professor who had this Vermeer painting that he thought was an original. He'd been hiding it for years. It was given to him by his father, but he wanted somebody to authenticate and say it was really a Vermeer before he decided to take it out of its frame and burn it, which seems a really bizarre, strange thing to do. But then as we started looking at the background, it started to piece together and make sense. Cornelius Engelbrecht's father, as we see, was a German who had stolen that particular painting from a Jewish household in Amsterdam on August 6, 1942, after a midnight raid. Here comes another dependent clause. When a boy hidden under tablecloths was kicked out and herded to a train deporting Jews to Westerbork, his guilt, this is going to be the main clause, by association, kept him from enjoying the girl in the painting who, in his father's words, had an eye like a blue pearl. So we were working on this example when we stopped. We're going to look at it again a little bit more carefully, and then we can continue the story in a way that'll make sense. In that first clause, and I'll do this one for you, father was the subject, had stolen is the verb of D-1, and I remind you that when you go through these and on the test you're going to take, first go in order, get the clause, determine what you have, and immediately start a drawing. And then we say, knowing that his German father had stolen it from a Jewish household in Amsterdam on August 6, 1942 after a midnight raid, and now we have when a boy hidden under tablecloths was kicked out and herded, and that's going to give us D-2, to a train deporting Jews to Westerbork, and then we have a comma here that's important, and we have guilt by association kept him from enjoying the girl in the painting, and we said that was a main clause. And then finally, who, in his father's words, had an eye like a blue pearl. So if I were taking a test, I would have marked my clauses. I would have said this was D-2, this was M-1, this over here is D-3. I'd have such a drawing. I personally would make a little drawing notation. One main clause, clause tabulation if you like, 3 dependent clauses, gives me one complex sentence, and I would list the subordinate connectives in order. This is what we're going to do this morning. That, and when, and then who. And I said there was an important comma after Westerbork because you have a dependent clause in front of the main clause. There would be no comma or any punctuation after painting next to who, because when you have a dependent clause following a main clause, there is no pause. There is no comma. So we'll follow that through. That was that chapter. And now the next chapter takes us back a certain period of time to the household where that little boy who was hiding under the tablecloths lived. So this is what we get. After peeling back a layer of time, as you would peel back the skin of an onion, the reader is placed inside of that Jewish home where the painting of the young girl looking out of her window hung before the onset of that Black Thursday raid. Yvonne, where's your first subject?
You.
How about the verb?
Would peel.
And the kind of clause?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
As.
So you label it and start a drawing right here. And where's your next subject?
Reader
And the verb?
is placed.
And the kind of clause?
Main clause.
And this would be a main clause. Label it. Where's your next subject?
Painting.
And the verb?
Hung.
And the type of clause?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
Where.
So, big picture, how many dependent clauses do you have?
2.
And how many main?
1.
So it's what kind of sentence?
Complex.
And your subordinators in order are
As and when. Where.
as and where. And you have a comma right after onion because,
The dependent clause comes before the main clause
but none between home and where.
because
Why
the
not?
dependent clause follows the main clause.
Exactly. Let's try the next one. Saul Vredenberg bought it for his daughter Hannah 2 years earlier, just prior to her 11th birthday, when he put in the highest bid at an auction that was meant to aid poor Jewish refugees. Farah, where's your subject?
Saul Fredenberg.
Really loud. Where's your verb?
But
Bought. I wonder what kind of a clause that is.
main clause.
Main clause. So you start a drawing immediately. Where's the next subject?
He
And the verb?
put
And the kind of clause.
dependent
And the
clause
subordinate?
when
Where's your next subject?
that
And the verb?
was meant to aid.
Was meant to aid. And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent
And your
clause
subordinate?
that
So, how many main clauses do you have?
1,
How many dependent?
2,
What kind of a sentence?
complex sentence.
And your subordinators are?
When and that.
So I would list them. And why do you have no punctuation between birthday and when, between auction and that?
Because the main clause comes before the dependent clause.
Exactly. The main clause is before both dependent clauses. No punctuation is needed. Now, his diamond selling business was over, whereas the carrier pigeons housed in a coop above the attic that formerly carried diamonds in small canisters around their necks from Hannah's father in Amsterdam to his partner in Antwerp were not allowed to be owned by Jews and were about to be killed. Scott, where's the first subject that you see?
Business,
And the verb?
was,
And the kind of clause?
main,
So that's a main clause. Where's your next subject?
pigeons,
And the verb? And you have to look for that verb.
yeah, were allowed to be owned.
Were allowed to be owned. And I wonder what kind of a clause that is.
Dependent,
Where's the subordinate?
whereas,
So this is going to be D-1. And then where's your next subject?
good question.
Well, let's just read it. Now his diamond selling business was over, whereas the carrier pigeons housed in a coop above the attic that formerly carried diamonds in small canisters, and we just passed that clause.
That,
That. And where's the verb?
carried,
And the kind of clause?
dependent,
And the subordinate?
that,
So this is going to be D-2. It's going to look like that. And we have another verb here that goes with what? Whereas pigeons were allowed to be owned, and where's the other part of that verb? I think you have a second verb in that clause. Anybody see it but
Were.
me?
Were.
Were what?
to be killed.
I almost want to pick that up and say this is a part of it. I know that there's that preposition in there, but just for the moment. So, big picture, it gives us how many main clauses?
1,
And how many dependent?
2,
And what kind of a sentence?
complex,
You have what as your subordinate connectives here?
whereas, and that,
So, whereas and that. You have a comma after attic. You have a comma after Antwerp. I wonder why.
these are great questions.
It's a tricky sentence.
It really is.
Anybody know? Maritza?
Because the dependent clause is in middle, the other
another-
dependent clause,
Yeah.
and also the information is non-essential.
Non-restrictive, non-essential. A renamer for those pigeons. They're the ones who carry the diamonds in the canisters. By the way, if you're having a close look at the textbook, you see canister spelled with 2 N's, and we know that it's spelled with 1, which is a good reminder on the importance of using spell check. for all concerned, including me. Let's try another one. Hannah watched her mother clean house and prepare for the Passover dinner, and thought about the quiet girl in the painting who had unspoken desires like she did, but who did not have to come up with answers for a 9-year-old brother like Tobiah, who wanted to know why one side of a leaf had 24 spikes while the other side of it only had 22. Pippa, where's a subject?
Hannah
And a verb.
watched and thought.
Watched her mother clean house, and you're missing a verb.
Thought.
Before you ever get there,
Oh. Prepare.
and what kind of a clause is that?
Main.
So that's a main clause, and then where's your next subject?
Who
And the verb?
had unspoken desires.
No, because in this case, unspoken is going to modify desires.
So then just
So
had.
it's going to be just had. And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent.
And your subordinate?
Who.
So this is going to be D-1. Where's your next subject?
She.
And the verb?
Did.
And the kind of clause?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
Like.
So this is going to be D-2. And another subject?
Who
And the verb?
did have
50%.
to come.
And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
Who.
Okay, so that's going to be D-3. Anything else?
Yeah. Who
And the verb?
wanted to know.
And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
Like.
Oh, no, it's not going to be like.
Who.
You already took
Oh,
care of
who?
this, like she did, but who'd not have to come up with
No,
answers.
Yeah, it's who.
It's
'cause-
going to be
yeah.
who. So this is going to be D-4. And then you have another subject,
Side.
side. And the verb?
Had.
And the kind of clause?
Dependent.
And the subordinate.
Why.
So this is going to be D-5. And you still have another subject,
Side.
and the verb,
Had.
and the kind of clause,
Dependent.
and the subordinate.
While.
So that gives us a total of how many main clauses?
1.
And how many dependent?
6.
It's what kind of a sentence?
Complex.
And you have a whole lot of subordinate connectives to list. What are they?
First one is who.
Who? And then?
Like.
Like?
Who.
Who?
Who.
Who?
Why.
Why?
While.
And while. And at least this part right here, Hannah watched her mother clean house and prepare for the Passover dinner, and thought about the quiet girl in the painting who had, right here, between painting and who, that one for sure. No punctuation there because?
Because the main clause is before the dependent.
Exactly, the main clause is in front of the
Question.
dependent clause. Question.
I see the main clause, Hannah watched and Hannah thought,
And Hannah watched her mother clean house.
but it's her mother that's
Yes,
cleaning
you're
the
right.
house and
Prepare,
preparing
yeah.
for
Absolutely
Passover
right.
dinner, so it's
You're
not.
absolutely right. Pippa was right in the first place. So it's the mother, clean and prepare, which is just thrown in there. This is the object, and this object has a main clause involved in it. You know, we saw this kind of thing before one time. I'm going to show you where we saw it. We were looking at something totally different. We were talking, not in this course, about the lyrics to the song, Singing in the Rain. And we had let the stormy clouds chase everyone from the place. And this seems to be acting the same way.
Right.
In this particular sentence, Scott, what would you say a subject is?
An implied you,
Okay, that's for sure. And if that's the case, you have a verb as well.
let,
And that gives us what kind of a clause?
main.
And then you really actually do have another subject.
But it's the object of the main clause.
Yeah, and it has a verb that goes with it too. And we're going to lose that verb unless I put it someplace else. I'll put it right here. Let the stormy clouds chase everyone from the place. So where is that next subject?
Clouds,
And how about your verb?
chase.
All right. And this whole part, stormy clouds chase, turns out to be a main clause acting as an object. Very similar to when you say, I ate an apple. I is the subject, ate is the verb, apple is the object. Well, here you is the subject. Led is the verb, and stormy clouds chase is the object. So now we've got, I think I want to use a colored highlighter on this. Now we've got Hannah, which is a subject, and we've got watched, which is a verb, and we've got mother, clean and prepare. That's a main clause acting as the object of that main clause. Good. Good eye. It's exactly what it is. And writing gets very complicated. I mean, these are my examples, and they get very complicated. When I sit down and I analyze them, they're very, very complicated. Let's try this one. Knowing it was just days before they would be herded out of their house, wearing yellow stars sewn onto their garments to mark them as Jews, she spared her young brother the anguish of seeing his pet pigeons die by going up to the attic and strangling each one before joining her family for their last Seder dinner. You could call this novel a very dark novel. It is a very dark novel. Scott, where's the subject?
It
And how about a verb?
was
And what kind of a clause is that?
dependent,
Where's your subordinate?
implied that.
And implied that. So this is D-1. Where's your next subject?
They
And a verb?
would be herded.
Would be herded. And what kind of a clause is that?
That's a dependent.
And the subordinate?
Before.
Okay. So this is D-2. And where's your next subject?
She
And the verb?
spared.
And the kind of clause.
That's a main.
So here's a main clause. Do we have anything else? No, we don't. So you have a total of how many main clauses?
1,
And how many dependent?
2.
What kind of a sentence?
It is a complex.
And your subordinates in order are,
That. Before.
and you have, one more question, a comma after Jews because,
Because the dependent clauses come before the main clause.
exactly. Good. And there's an image I want you to take a look at of what this Jewish star sewn onto a coat looked like. If you were a Jew and you were living, as Anne Frank was, by the way, in Holland at this time, she was in Amsterdam, you had a star that identified you, and you were on your way to be deported. It's that terrible time of the Holocaust, and this was evidence of what you had. So now we're going to go back another block of time, and we're going to go to that village of Vreeland that has the same name that the author does. In the next chapter, another layer of time is peeled back, bringing the reader into the village of Vreeland, where a husband and his wife are walking several steps behind their daughter Johanna, who has broken with family tradition by announcing her marriage to Fritz and her intention of moving to Amsterdam without having asked for her parents' consent. Maritza, where's the subject?
Layer
Layer. And where's a verb?
is peel,
Is peeled. And what kind of a clause is that?
main clause.
That gives us a main clause. Where's another subject?
Husband and wife
And how about your verb?
are walking.
And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent,
Where's your subordinate?
where,
So this is going to be D-1. And where's your next subject?
who
And the verb?
has broken.
And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent,
Where's the subordinate?
who,
So this is going to be D-2. How many main clauses do you have?
1,
And how many dependent?
2,
What kind of, well, just a minute, what kind of a sentence is this?
complex,
Right, and I actually was looking at this, and this is not what's happening. It is complex. And your subordinate connectives are?
where and who.
Right. What I was looking at was the comma after Joanna. I need to see this comma as well to see why that comma is there. It's because Joanna is a renamer to the dependent where clause. Okay. Let's try number 10. Joanna's mother is thinking about a wedding gift that will be a constant reminder of her family life, which is proving to be difficult because she does not want to give the young couple something as ordinary as a broom and a butter churn. Janice, where's the subject?
Mother
And how about a verb?
is thinking,
And what kind of a clause is that?
main,
Give me another subject.
that
Yes, you're right. And a verb?
will be
Will be. And what kind of a clause?
dependent,
And the subordinate?
which,
No.
oh, that,
That. And you have another subject
which
and a verb?
is proving to be
Is proving to be. And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent,
Where's the subordinate?
which,
So this is D-2. You have another subject,
she
verb,
does want to give.
good. And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent,
Where's your subordinate?
because.
So this is D-3. How many main clauses do you have?
1,
How many dependent?
3,
What kind of a sentence?
complex.
And your subordinates in order are
That, which, and because.
that, which, and because. You have no punctuation after gift. You have none after life. You have none after difficult. Why not?
Because all the dependent clauses follow after the main.
Good. Now, you see what's happening here. This is going to be a culture and a tradition shift, because here are these parents who've grown up in this one little village for most of their life. At least they've raised their child in that particular village. And now, first of all, the daughter's going to go off and get married, and she didn't say, can I? She told them when and where she was going to be living. That's the first thing. Now, here's this poor mother who's trying to figure out an appropriate wedding gift, and she selects it, and a problem comes up that she had no way of anticipating. After settling on the perfect gift, the painting she calls Girl with a Sewing Basket, her husband objects because he bought it for her on an anniversary, although it reminded him of an earlier love, Tanake, who once held the palm of her hand up waiting to be kissed, just as the girl does in the unsigned painting by Vermeer. Vince, where's the subject?
She
I'll go ahead and take she. Where's the verb that goes with that?
calls,
Calls. There should be a space. What kind of a clause?
main clause.
No.
Really?
And I wonder why not. Justin, do you have any idea why that's not a main clause?
Because after subordinate connective.
No, actually, after settling on the perfect gift, we'll just get rid of all this. It's going to turn out to be a prep phrase of some kind with a flip-flop pattern that we'll be discussing a little bit later. Do you have any idea, Maritza, why she calls is not a main clause?
I thought it was a dependent clause.
I think it is too. And where's the subordinate?
That implied that.
And where does the implied that go?
Depending that, she
Right.
calls.
That's right. So this part of it is going to turn out to be a dependent clause. All right. Now, Vince, let's see if we can pick up the pieces. Where is another subject?
Has been
Husband
and is that object?
objects. I want to back this up just to see if we're right. After settling on the perfect gift, the painting that she calls Girl with a Sewing Basket, her husband objects. What kind of a clause is that?
Dependent.
Where's the subordinate?
Implied that.
No, the implied that goes with she calls. Let's back this up again. After settling on the perfect gift, we are going to wind up calling that a prep phrase. The painting that she calls Girl with a Sewing Basket, her husband objects. Is that the way it's reading in your book? Because this is coming out. Let's see. Let's just piece it together. Let's just go husband objects. What kind of a clause is that going to be?
Main clause.
I think it's going to be a main clause. Right now that sentence is troubling me. Where's another subject?
Right. He
And the verb?
thought
And what kind of a clause? This is an easy one.
the dependent.
So the subordinate here is,
Because
okay. We'll come back and sort this out. Where's another subject?
It,
And a verb?
remind,
And what kind of a clause is that?
dependent,
This is another easy one, and the subordinate is going to be
although,
so that's going to give us another dependent clause. And then there's another subject.
who,
Yes,
who,
you're right. And the verb?
once held,
Held. And the kind of clause? And
dependent,
the subordinate?
who,
So this is going to be another dependent clause. You still have another subject.
girl,
Girl. And the verb? Easy verb. Does.
does,
And the kind of clause?
dependent,
Where's the subordinate?
as,
If we're right, that would give us how many main clauses?
Five. I mean,
No.
no, one.
One, and how many dependent clauses?
Five.
And if we're right, again, this is going to give us what kind of a sentence?
A complex.
All right, I want to go back and read this again. After settling on the perfect gift, the painting that she calls Girl with a Sewing Basket, this whole thing is a renamer to gift. You see that? I want to try that again. After settling on the perfect gift, this dependent clause renames the object of this phrase, the painting that she calls Girl with a Sewing Basket. Then we get this main clause and this whole string of dependent clauses. Very tricky. What are your subordinate connectives? Just recite them to me. What do you have? You've got 5.
That.
That?
Because.
Mm-hmm.
Although.
Yes?
Who. And as.
Yes. Okay. Now you see the problem, right? The husband buys his wife an anniversary present because it reminds him of some woman he loved before he married the wife. So that's going to cause some problems. And here's the wife's reaction. Stung by jealousy about the unknown rival, Digna stitches a sampler with words that prohibit all mention of past memories, while her husband gets ready to part with the painting that has served him as a constant reminder of the woman he met and lost decades earlier in 1874, when his job was pumping water out of Vreeland's water-drenched soil. See, women never get over that kind of jealousy about former rivals. Justin, where is the subject?
Digna.
Digna, and how about a verb?
Stitches.
And what kind of a clause?
Main.
So that's a main clause. And where's another subject?
Husband.
Wherever you are, you're too far.
Okay.
Try to go in order or you can't run a punctuation check on yourself.
Okay.
Let's just start reading it through and see what happens. Stung by jealousy about the unknown rival, Digna stitches a sampler with words that prohibit all mention of past memories. And we just hit another clause. So your subject is
That.
and your verb,
Prohibit.
and the kind of clause,
Dependent.
and the subordinate.
That.
So that's going to be D-1. Now where's your next subject?
Husband.
Now it's going to be husband. And how about the verb?
Gets ready to part.
And what kind of a clause will that be?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
While.
So that's going to be D-2. And then?
That.
And the verb?
Has served.
And the kind of clause?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
That.
So that's D-3. And another, be careful with this one, gets ready to part with the painting that has served him as a constant reminder of the woman he met and lost decades earlier. What do you see?
Subject is he.
And the verb?
Met and lost.
And the kind of clause?
Dependent.
Where's the subordinate?
As.
No. Anybody know?
It has to imply.
Implied what?
As the constant reminder of the woman. I want to say whom
Yes, you do. With an M, I hope.
or the M.
Right. We'll go back to that one. This is going to be a dependent clause right here. It's actually going to be D-4. And Justin, do you see another subject?
Job.
How about a verb?
Was.
More?
Pumping.
And the kind of clause?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
When.
Okay. So let's just get the big picture. How many main clauses do you have?
1.
And how many dependent?
5.
And your sentence type is?
Complex.
Right. Now, the only trouble spot here was right here. The woman whom he met and lost decades earlier in 1874. Now, we did this the other day. You get up to this point and you have to make a decision. Do I want who? Do I want whom? So you ask a question. Who did he meet and lose decades earlier? And you answer your question. He met and lost a woman. He met and lost her.
It becomes.
So it's going to be the object whom. Good. And no internal punctuation on these clauses because you have dependent clauses following a main clause. Yes?
Carol, prohibit, shouldn't there be prohibits?
Words prohibit.
Well, now, words, with words, that's a prep, right? So wouldn't that go back to the sampler?
No, because when you have a prepositional phrase following like that, it's going to agree with the object of the preposition and
Okay,
not with
so-
the sampler.
Okay.
The words prohibit, the sampler doesn't prohibit. The words do. Pippa?
Okay, so in complex sentences, you always only have one main clause, right?
Total of one, anything more is gonna be wrong.
Which means any other subject or anything you find besides that main clause has to be dependent.
Well, I hate to say yes all the time. It means if you have a subordinate connective
90% of the
and a subject and a verb, then you're gonna have dependent clauses. But you're right about the first part, really right about the first part. One main clause, total.
So you know if you have two, something's wrong, and you need to go
Well,
back
you know
and
you
find
don't
an
have a
implied
complex
or
sentence,
something.
right. And my guess is that once we go through and we get sentence structure totally reviewed, totally studied, most of your writing, you're probably going to use simple and complex sentences because they can get quite long and quite complicated as we're seeing. And I imagine you're going to use the compound and the compound complex, I don't know when you develop your own style, a little less frequently because they can really get long and convoluted as we're going to see down the road. Well, I want to go back to this example for content for a minute. Here's this man reminiscing about this woman that he'd met and lost decades earlier in 1874 when his job was pumping water out of Vreeland's water-drenched soil. And I wanted to look at that because I wanted to show you a picture of a typical windmill in Holland. And this windmill is near Delft, actually. But did you think they were just decorative? They're not. The thing about Holland, very odd, is that it really is below water. And so when you are looking in a train, the land is over here, and the water is in these canals, but the land sometimes over here gets lower than this level right here. And if there's a flood, they're in trouble. And those windmills are there to pump out the water. And without the windmills, the whole country would be flooded. There would be no Holland. So they're not decorative. They're very pretty. They're lovely. But they are there serving a very important function. And when it's flooded, as happens in this novel, sometimes even all the windmills can't get all the water out, and the result is a disaster. Well, now we're going back in the next chapter 100 years earlier than where we were just a minute ago. So going back 100 years earlier to the 1790s, when Napoleon had conquered Holland, we see the same painting hung in the drawing room of a mansion rented by a tax collector from France by the name of Gerard, whose disenchanted wife, Claudine, tells us about her life in The Hague. Something looks very wrong in the spelling. Anybody see it besides me? At least it looks wrong. Perhaps not. I would have to check. Who's walking around with a dictionary? Look up Napoleon and see if we got it right. And then we'll go to check. Right now, at the moment, this hour of the morning, I never trust my eye. Always check and see if it's right.
It's E-O-N, isn't it?
I don't know. And you see what can happen even with a word like canister. You can wind up with two N's instead of one, so when in doubt, just check.
According to this is fine.
Okay, then we're fine. Always check. Always check. It's fine in the book.
Yeah.
Okay, so now, where is a subject, Ben?
Napoleon
It's going to be Napoleon. And how about a verb?
had conquered.
Yes, and what kind of a clause?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
When?
Yes. So that's going to be D-1. We'll just get it up there. And where's your next subject?
We.
And the verb?
See.
And the kind of clause?
Main.
It is a main clause. Where's your next subject?
Painting.
We see the same painting hung, no.
No. Okay. Mansion.
Mansion of a mansion is going to be a what?
Prep phrase.
Right. I think you have to go further down the road.
Tax collector.
No, you're guessing. That's going to be the object of another prep phrase. Evelyn, where's that next subject that I'm looking for?
Wife
It's going to be wife. Where's the verb?
tells us.
And not just tells. And what kind of a clause is that going to be?
Is that dependent?
Yes, it is. And your subordinate is going to be?
Is it when?
No. Is it what?
When?
No, not at all. Who sees a subordinate connective? Maritza?
Whose?
Sure, we haven't seen that before, but that's
After
surely
Gerard.
functioning as a dependent clause. So, big picture, Ben, how many main clauses do we have?
One.
And how many dependent?
Two.
What kind of a sentence?
Complex.
I wonder why there's a comma after Holland.
Because the main clause comes after the dependent.
Right, and there's no punctuation between Gerard and whose because the dependent clause is where? This dependent whose clause is where?
After the main.
After the main clause, right. So now we have this French tax collector living in The Hague.
Going back to that, on the last dependent clause, the subject's not Claudine. I thought wife is.
Either way.
Either way? Okay.
Either way, if there had been commas around Claudine, I surely would have said wife.
Wife.
But if you want to say wife, Claudine, take the whole thing. It's not going to change the big picture that we're looking at a dependent clause.
Okay.
Well, let's have a look at tulip fields near The Hague. And do remember that The Hague is 3 miles away from Delft, where Vermeer lived. Now, this was taken from a train window going from Delft back to Amsterdam, but I tell you, photographs don't do these tulip fields justice. They're absolutely incredible. If the color were really good, you could see purple ones in that far horizon, next to yellow ones, next to orange ones, next to red ones. The whole country of Holland is a blaze of color. Now here's this French wife of the tax collector, and look what it says. Having been forced to marry a man of her father's choosing, she's not sure about what love is, but is drawn like a moth to a light to a violinist, Monsieur Le C, who agrees to give a concert at her home for a few members of the former Dutch nobility. Elbelin, let's try this. Where's your subject?
She
And your verb?
is sure.
I sure, you sure, he
No,
sure.
is.
I think I want to just say is. And what kind of a clause is that?
Main
That's definitely a main clause. So where's your next subject?
love
And the verb?
is
And you know, you have more verb to that,
drawn.
is drawn, because but is a coordinate connective that connects those two verbs together. What kind of a clause is this?
Dependent.
Where's your subordinate?
What?
And I'm going to change that to about what. I'll come back to why in a minute. I agree with you that it's a dependent clause. Is there another subject?
Monsieur let's see.
Now forget, to a violinist, Monsieur Le C is going to be a what?
Prep phrase.
Prep phrase. So where's your next subject? Who and your verb?
Agrees
More?
to give a concert.
Too much?
To give.
Agrees to give. And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent.
And your subordinate?
Who?
So this is going to give us D-2. How many main clauses do we have?
1,
And how many dependent?
2.
What kind of a sentence?
Complex.
And about what, take a good look, is a prepositional phrase, isn't it? About is a preposition, and what is a pronoun object. It also double functions as the subordinate connective for that dependent clause, and in so doing, it becomes a variation of what? Okay? Now, the concert is given, and look what happens next. After the concert, she lures the musician into the drawing room to show him the one Dutch object she values, which is the painting of the girl wearing a hyacinth blue smock that was bought at an auction in Amsterdam by her husband, who has papers proving it to be a genuine work by Jan van der Meer. Pippa, where's the subject?
She,
And the verb?
lures,
And the kind of clause?
dependent,
Where's the subordinate?
after,
What do you call this after the concert?
prep phrase,
And watch out, that's one of those 6 words that can go either way. You remember that? Depending on what it's followed by. So this she lures is what kind of a clause?
main,
Yes, you ignore the prep phrase. We could toss that right out of the picture. Where's your next subject?
she,
And the verb?
values,
I'm going to back you into that. She lures the musician, God bless you, into the drawing room to show him the one Dutch object she values. I wonder what kind of a clause that is.
dependent,
Where's the subordinate?
implied that,
Yes. Where does it go?
after object and before she.
So it's right here. So this is D-1. And then?
Which
And the verb?
is
And the kind of clause.
dependent,
And the subordinate?
which,
So this is going to be D-2. And then?
that,
And the verb.
was,
More?
bought,
And what kind of a clause is that?
dependent,
And the subordinate?
that,
So that's going to be D-3. And the next subject?
who,
And the verb?
has,
and the kind of clause,
Dependent,
and the subordinate.
who?
So how many main clauses do we have?
1,
And how many dependent clauses?
4.
4. And that makes this what kind of a sentence?
Complex,
Complex. Good. Now notice the name of that artist, Jan van der Meer, which by the way means, I suppose, John in the lake. It does. Meer means lake.
Okay.
So now,
Poor guy.
before a passionate intrigue can be carried out, a noise in the room causes her to stop and light a match, which reveals her husband, a known womanizer, who's about to engage in a similar intrigue with the Countess Moritz. Farah, where is a subject?
Intrigue
Intrigue. And how about the verb?
can be carried
And the kind of clause?
dependent
And the subordinate?
before
Okay. Where's your next subject?
noise
Noise. And the verb?
causes
And the kind of clause?
main clause,
That's your main clause. Give me another subject.
which
And the verb?
reveals
And the kind of clause?
dependent,
Where's your subordinate?
which,
Good. And another subject.
who,
And the verb?
is, to,
I want
and
to say just is.
is.
This is a toss-up because there's that preposition again in front of that half verb, but we'll say is. What kind of a clause is it?
Dependent,
And where's your subordinate?
who,
So, I'm a little slow on the drawing. How many main clauses do you have?
1,
And how many dependent?
3,
It's what kind of a sentence?
complex sentence,
I wonder why there's a comma after out.
because the dependent clause comes before the main clause.
And there's no punctuation after match, and there's none, well, there is one here, but for a different reason. Let's talk about this one. There's no punctuation after match because,
Because the main clause comes before the dependent clause.
right, and this comma, the one before and after unknown womanizer, that's just a renamer that serves to modify husband. Okay,
Carol, I have a question.
sure.
The part that said light and match, the light in there is acting as a verb?
It's part of the infinitive to stop, to light,
Okay,
so that carries over to both.
all right.
Okay. The scandal that will spread throughout The Hague causes her to wrap the small painting in muslin without its papers and sell it to an art dealer who gives her enough money to leave her husband, hire a carriage, and return to her home in France. Scott, where's the subject now?
Scandal,
And how about the verb?
causes,
And the kind of clause?
main,
So that's a main clause. Where's the next subject?
that,
And the verb?
will spread,
And the kind of clause?
dependent,
And the subordinate?
that,
So that looks like this. Where's your next subject?
who,
And the verb?
gives,
And the kind of clause?
dependent,
And where's the subordinate?
who,
So how many main clauses do you have?
1,
And how many dependent?
2,
What kind of a sentence?
complex.
Why is there no punctuation, would you imagine, after scandal and after The Hague? And I'm talking about here.
The dependent clause comes inside the main clause, and
Is
It-
restrictive, is necessary.
yes, it is.
The writer made that call. And when the writer makes that call, no commas are in sight. So now, after taking a final look at the expression in the eyes of the girl in the painting, she realizes that this young woman would have known what love was and that she would have been willing to follow the man she had joined her life with to the ends of the earth when it was time for her to marry. Scott, where's a subject?
She
And how about a verb?
realizes.
And the kind of clause?
It would be a main clause.
So this is a main clause. Give me another subject.
Woman
And the verb?
would have known.
Would have known. And the kind of clause?
It's a dependent.
And your subordinate?
That.
Okay. And where's your next subject?
Love
And the verb?
was
And the kind of clause?
dependent.
Subordinate?
What
So this is going to be D-2. And the next subject?
she
And the verb?
would have been willing to follow.
That's a long verb. And what kind of a clause is that?
It's dependent.
And the subordinate?
That.
So that's going to be D-3. And another subject?
She
And the verb?
joined.
More? More than joined. It's a two-word verb. I see 2 words. Do you not have 2 words? I've got had joined. Did you just have joined?
We just have joined.
Joined.
Okay, then let me change that. Okay? And
Like
what
what?
kind of a clause is that?
That is a dependent clause?
Where is your subordinate?
It's an implied whom.
Definitely. Who did she join her life to? She joined her life to the man. She joined her life to him. So that gives us another dependent clause. You have another subject
It
and a verb
was
and the kind of clause.
dependent
And the subordinate.
when.
So total of how many main clauses
1,
and how many dependent clauses?
5.
What kind of a sentence?
It's a complex sentence.
Okay, good. How about 19? This was not to be for our narrator, Claudine, who married a man she did not love and was not able to bear him a child, which had caused them to grow even further apart. Janice, where's the subject?
This
How about a verb?
was to
Right,
be.
yeah, right where you are.
Was.
Wait, yeah, you're right. It is was. We're going to ignore not, and I agree with you. What kind of a clause?
Main.
And give me another subject
Who
and a verb
married.
and the kind of a clause.
Dependent.
And the subordinate,
Who.
okay? And where's another subject?
Which.
You're way too far. Let's go back. But
She.
this was not to be, it's going to be she. For our narrator, Claudine, who married a man, she, where's the verb?
Did.
Did what?
Love.
And where's the other part of that verb?
Not a.
Forget not.
To bear.
That's only a half verb. Go further left. She did
Was.
not love and was. And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent.
Where's the subordinate?
Implied whom.
Who didn't she love? She didn't love the man. She didn't love him. So that's going to be D-2. And you have another subject
Which.
and the verb?
Had.
More?
Caused.
And the kind of clause.
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
Which.
So how many main clauses do you have?
1.
How many dependent?
3.
And what kind of a sentence is it?
Complex.
Okay. Mourning the loss of the painting that was now an illegitimate child because it went out into the world without its certification, she consoled herself with the thought that she would be back in Paris where the newest hairdos and the latest fashions would feed her desire for elegance, if not her desire for love. Yvonne, where's the subject?
That
How about a verb?
was
And the kind of a clause?
dependent.
And the subordinate?
That
Double function on that, so that's a dependent clause. Where's your next subject?
it
And the verb?
went
And the kind of clause.
dependent
Where's the subordinate?
because
So this is D-2. And then?
she
And the verb?
consoled.
And the kind of clause?
Main clause.
So this is a main clause. And your next subject?
She
And the verb?
would be
Would be. And the kind of clause?
dependent.
Subordinate?
That
Okay. And your next subject?
hairdos and fashions.
Hairdos and fashions. And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
Where? And the verb would be
So-
would feed.
Would be.
Would feed. Yeah.
That's right. And so this is going to be D-4. How many main clauses do we have?
1.
How many dependent clauses do we
4.
have? What kind of a sentence is it?
Complex.
Why is there a comma after certification?
Because 2 dependent clauses comes before the main clause.
And there's no punctuation after thought, and there's none after Paris.
2 dependent clauses follow the main clause.
Exactly. 2 different rules applying. Well, that's that exercise. Does anybody have a burning question? I want you to go to laying out the text on page 149, and let's talk about the cover sheet for the next test. In this part of it, we're going to stick to and do it as it says. You're going to print your name, the course, the hour, and the date in ink, okay? And that due date is going to be sent to you on a listserv memo. But since you have no A and B blanks where you can fill in the required subject choices, I want you to add this information to that cover page on page 149. Just write in right now, if you would, category A or category B. And once you have those categories given to you via a listserv memo, write them both in and circle the one that you selected. And remember that your test is going to look like this. You're going to have your name in the upper left-hand corner, the course, the due date, and you're going to do your sentences, number them as you go in the left-hand column, 1 through 10. I'm going to urge you, please, to track your clauses, but I don't think I'm going to have to urge too hard when we look at some samples from the last test. Some typing reminders. Do people use a size 14 font? And as I just said, be sure you number your examples. Don't do this paragraph fashion. Do it as a quiz. Number from 1 to 10 on the left. Please double space. Please use justified text. Proofread very carefully. I suggest you read things out loud. I see when I read things out loud, I catch errors that otherwise remain. You want to eliminate all spelling errors, all grammatical errors, and you really need to track your clauses. As you can see by looking at what we did today, these sentences can become quite complicated. So you should have a line under every subject, under every verb. You can do that once you print out your test. And you don't have a way of circling subordinate connectives on a computer, but you can bold them, can't you? Make yourself a note. Bold the subordinates, and you'll know where your dependent clauses are. And then you want to label the type of clauses you're presenting because it's going to give you a visual check on the kind of sentence you're aiming to produce here. I'm telling you, people, read it out loud to a wall. And when you're done, staple that cover sheet, page 147, to your finished paper before you submit it for a grade. Now, once again, the information to put on that cover sheet is going to be sent to you on a listserv memo, and you always want to refer to a listserv memo for due dates. In this case, the due date for quiz number 2 on the complex sentence. Well, I want to take you back to the last quiz and go over with you the grading scale for a 10-point pop quiz, which is what this is. It's not exactly a pop quiz, it's a planned quiz, but it's a pretty short one. 9 and 10 are the A range, and 8 is a B. 7 is a C, 6 is a D, 5 is an F. These grading symbols that I use, you should have a note on. FRAG means you wrote a fragment, it's a non-sentence. If it's RTS, yes, Maritza.
That's on page 157.
I know, you do have it in your book, and I'm just going over that with you. RTS means you have a run-on. SP means you have a spelling error. If it's a number, it could be plural instead of singular. Like if you said, I ate sandwich for lunch, then it's either going to be sandwiches or it's going to be wrong. It's either going to be a spelling and a number error or a diction one. If it's marked with a P, it's a punctuation error. APOS means you have apostrophe, owed to me. POSSESS, the word should have been possessive. WW, you used the wrong word. AWK, what you wrote was awkward. You're going to see a lot of this diction. You're putting in and the where it doesn't belong, or you're not putting it in where it should be there. Under AGR, agreement error, often it's when you have, in fact, I'll talk about these errors in just a second. You can see what they are. MM is a misplaced modifier. DM is a dangling modifier. Tense, for some reason, your word is in the wrong tense. And coherence means that what you wrote doesn't make any sense at all. And since you have it in front of you in the book, an agreement error, you mix a singular subject with a plural verb and you get something like this: it don't matter. Or you take a plural subject and you mix it together with a singular verb and you get they doesn't count. Those are agreement errors. In the case of a misplaced modifier, often, not always, you have an awkward split between a subject and a verb. I, in order to find a parking place, drove all around the school. You don't want that. You want I drove all around the school. Get your subject and your verb together in order to find a parking place. And when it comes to dangling modifiers, it's a phrase placed next to a noun that makes no sense. My favorite one in the whole world is eating popcorn and drinking Coke. The television stayed on till midnight, but television sets don't eat popcorn and they don't drink Coke, and you can't say that. So this is wrong. Eating popcorn and drinking Coke. The TV stayed on till midnight? No. Eating popcorn and drinking Coke. I watched television until midnight. Now, the other things on that list of things to watch out for, I'll come right back to it, Scott, are something marked UC, uppercase, you should have capitalized it. LC, lowercase, it shouldn't be capitalized. And anytime you see something marked this way, as you can figure out, CC, CX for sure, it means you didn't write a simple sentence. Whatever you did, you didn't have only one main clause. because you formed one of these sentence types that has to do with multiple clauses rather than a simple sentence which has only one main clause. Go ahead and ask your question, Scott.
Well, I just noticed in the dictionary the definition of the word diction, and there's two definitions. One is how you pronounce words, but the other is what you're talking about when you leave out a word or you add one that doesn't belong.
Right, and this one that I'm concerned about at the moment is where you put in a word that doesn't belong or leave one out that does. Okay. All right, we're going to take a look now at sample sentences from student papers on that last round, quiz number 1 on the simple sentences. Many of them come right from you. And unless you go, oh my God, it's mine, we'll never know whose sentence it is, and we're just going to worry about analyzing them. Before we start, give me a reminder, Ben. A simple sentence is what?
Main clause.
How many?
1.
Only one?
Yes.
Okay. So anything else is going to be wrong. Well, you remember that the two categories that we worked on were either your favorite foods or your favorite sports. So I want to look at some that had to do with foods first. Here's one. It is not true that alligator meat tastes like chicken. That's the sentence. Elbelin, where's the subject?
Um,
Did you see a subject?
yeah.
Where?
Is it it?
I'll take it. How about a verb?
Is?
And what kind of a clause is that?
Main?
Do you see another subject? Hesitating worries me because this was the problem I saw on the test. Farah, do you see another subject?
Meat?
Meat. And how about a verb?
Taste?
And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent?
Where's the subordinate?
That?
So I wonder what kind of a sentence this is.
Complex?
Right. And what kind of a test were we taking?
Simple sentence?
Simple. So it's dead wrong. Now, whoever wrote it, if you had tracked the clauses, the thing you would have found was, gee, I have a subject and a verb here, and I have a subject and a verb here. It doesn't matter what kind of a sentence it is. It can't be simple because you see two clauses. That should have been caught. Now, this is an interesting sentence. Where is the dumplings I just bought? These are coming vintage right off of your papers. Turn that around for me, if you would, Yvonne, and read it as a statement.
The dumplings I just bought is where?
That's right. Now, where's the subject?
Dumplings?
And how about a verb?
He has, that person has is.
And what kind of a clause is that going to be?
A dependent?
No,
I'm
it's
sorry,
not.
main.
It's going to be a main
Main.
clause. And where is your next subject?
I
And the verb.
bought.
And what kind of a clause is that?
I would say dependent.
And the subordinate
And
is?
implied that.
Where does it go?
Between dumplings and I.
So what kind of a sentence are we looking at now?
Complex.
Right. Now watch out for where, because when you turned that into a statement, you said, the dumplings that I just bought is where? Well, we have an agreement problem in
Yeah.
this sentence as well. And where is that? Dumplings, singular or plural?
Plural.
So can we use is?
No, it should be are.
So this is an agreement error. This is what I'm talking about. If you have a plural subject, you've got to have a plural verb. But it's the wrong kind of sentence, so it's wrong all the way around. The cleanup of the pizza after consuming is easy because no plates are used. Pippa, do you see a subject?
Oh boy.
Pippa, do you have glasses? Because you won't see anything at all without
I
glasses.
kind of forgot them today.
I forgot my glasses.
But wait,
The cleanup of the pizza after consuming is easy because no plates are used.
cleanup? Wait,
No wonder she has facial expressions that are not as alert as they might otherwise be.
are used is one of the verbs.
Are used is one of the verbs, and the subject that goes with it is
Goes no plates.
plates. And the kind of clause is,
Dependent,
and the subordinate is,
because, and then, is another verb.
yes, is another verb. And what about the subject? What is easy?
The cleanup.
Cleanup. And that gives us what kind of a clause?
A main.
A main clause. So what kind of a sentence are we looking at?
Complex.
And this is a diction error, among other things. What's missing? The cleanup of the pizza after consuming
Consuming it.
it. And there's another problem. This is a misplaced modifier. Where would you move it?
After the cleanup.
Well, or after consuming it. The cleanup of the pizza is easy because no plates are used, but this is this awkward split of your subject and your verb by this little phrase that really needs to be relocated. But the big picture is this is a complex sentence. Now here's another one, just as you wrote it, no editing. The seafood I enjoys the most is crabs. Scott, where's the subject?
Seafood
How about the verb that goes with it?
is,
And the kind of clause?
main,
Main, there's another subject.
I,
And the verb?
enjoys,
And the kind of clause?
that.
Well, there is a that. What kind of a clause is it? A dependent. So big picture, what kind of a sentence are we looking at?
Complex,
Now, is I singular? Is it plural?
it's singular.
So do we say enjoys?
No, it's enjoy.
So this would be an agreement error. A singular subject takes a singular verb, but it's the wrong kind of sentence. And I know you're thinking, I sat at home and made these up. No, these are right off of your tests. And I think part of the problem is you didn't proofread as well as you could have. This came right out of the studio. Because of seafood has an enough of protein, so most of people changing their lifestyle nowadays, eating the seafood instead of red or white meat. Janice, where's the subject?
Seafood
Well, it at least wants to be a subject. Where's the verb?
has
And what kind of a clause is that looking like it might want to be?
dependent
Where would the subordinate be?
because
All right, I agree with you. Now, technically, because of seafood, it looks like it's part of a prep phrase, but this is very awkward. It's hard to make this determination. There is another subject. Do you see another subject?
people
It's going to be people. And how about the verb?
changing
Is changing a whole verb or a half verb?
half
Where is the, yes, where's the word that we're missing here? This is a half verb. What's the whole thing? Because of seafood has an enough of protein, so most of people changing their lifestyle nowadays, eating the seafood instead of red or white meat. What are we really looking at here?
Are changing.
But it doesn't say are changing, does it?
Are changing.
So as you see it, what would you say you're looking at?
A verb.
Well, the whole thing, would you mark this? If you had an exam,
It would be
A
a fragment.
it's definitely a fragment. Okay, now, fixing it's pretty easy. At least the sentence structure, if you got rid of that, this would be a clear dependent clause. It's going to be the wrong sentence type. If you said most people are changing their lifestyles nowadays, eating seafood instead of red or white meat, at least we'd have a sentence, but it would be the wrong kind of sentence anyway. I don't believe if you read this out loud, you're not going to catch it. You won't make a believer out of me. Yes, Scott?
I think we should also cross out the words and of around enough. Has enough protein.
Diction.
Yeah, and of.
Right. I don't believe the writer read this out loud. You won't convince me that that was possible. Here's another. I love hot and sour soup. It's the best soup. Farah, where's the first subject that you see?
I
And the verb.
love
And the kind of clause?
main
Give me another subject.
it
And the verb?
is
And the kind of clause? Don't hesitate. Call it what you see.
dependent
Where's the subordinate? If you tell me it's dependent, you must see a subordinate. Do you see a subordinate?
No.
I don't either. What kind of a clause is it?
main
It's a main clause. It also happens to be a run-on. It also happens not to be a simple sentence. But you know what? If the writer had just stopped here, put a period, it would have been fine. And it's the best soup would have been fine for the next example. Again, tracking your clauses, you would have seen multiple clauses. Let's go to sports and look at some of the examples I saw there. The position I played last year on my school's basketball team was a point guard. Vince, do you see a subject?
I
How about the verb?
played.
And what kind of a clause is that going to be?
It's main.
No, it's not.
Really?
What is it, Maritza?
Dependent.
Where's the subordinate?
Imply that.
Where does it go?
After position.
So this is going to be a dependent clause. And now there's another subject.
Position.
And the verb?
Was.
And the kind of clause.
Main clause.
So what kind of a sentence is this?
Complex.
Wrong sentence type. I love this sentence, but it doesn't work. It's weird how they call football football when you don't even use your foot. I agree. Ben, where's the subject?
They
I'll take they,
call.
call.
Verb.
And the kind of clause?
Dependent.
And the subordinate.
How?
How? How about another subject?
You
And a verb?
don't
No. Do
use
use. And what kind of a clause is that?
main.
Main. You agree, Evelyn?
Dependent.
Where's the subordinate?
When.
There's another subject. Where? No? Scott, where?
It
And the verb.
is
And the kind of clause.
main,
What kind of a sentence is this?
complex.
Complex. Football has vastly changed. It used to be all about fun and excitement, but now the professional athletes are just in it for the money. Scott, where's your first subject?
Football
How about the verb?
has changed.
And this would be better moved over here. What kind of a clause do you have?
The main clause.
Give me another subject.
It
And the verb?
used to be
And the kind of a clause.
main.
Another main clause. Comma needed here. Where's another subject?
Athletes
And the verb?
are
And the kind of clause.
main.
So it's a compound sentence, but that wouldn't matter. Clearly it isn't a simple sentence because a simple sentence, Ben said, can only have one main clause. Let's take a look at this one. Badminton is my favorite because there is a lot mentality that deals with the game. Justin, where's the subject?
Badminton
And a verb.
is
And the kind of clause.
main.
Where's your next verb?
Is
And where's the subject that goes with it? See, I saw this there.
yeah.
So what is there? Can you flip that clause around? Who can? Go ahead, Yvonne.
A lot of mentality is there.
So that makes what the subject?
Mentality.
No,
No,
Oh, excuse me.
A lot.
Lot.
a lot. And what kind of a clause is that, Yvonne?
Dependent.
Where's the subordinate?
Because
All right. Another subject
that
and a verb.
deals.
And the kind of clause.
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
That.
So at best, this is what kind of a sentence?
Complex.
But this, to me, I would have to say coherence. What are we talking about? Because there is a lot mentality. Even if I add that preposition that you threw in, a lot of mentality that deals with the game, it doesn't make any sense to me. Now, maybe if I played badminton, it would, but the phrasing is off, and that doesn't make any sense. One of us in the studio wrote this: I hold my ping pong racket in what is called the Chinese style grip. Elbelin, where's the subject?
I.
Where's the verb?
Hold.
Type of clause.
Main.
Where's another subject?
What is it?
I'll take that for a minute. How about the verb?
Is called.
And the kind of clause?
Dependent.
And the subordinate?
What?
In what? You know, we saw another one of those today. What kind of a sentence is this?
Complex.
And in what is going to turn out to be a prepositional phrase, isn't it? In is a prep, and what is a pronoun object. The whole phrase serves as the subordinate connector for the dependent clause, and it becomes a variation of what. Someday, those three sports will have my utmost attention once I find a gym to play in. Now, this is an interesting one. Maritza, where's the subject?
Sports.
How about the verb?
We have
Type of clause.
main clause.
Where's your next subject?
I
And the verb?
find
And the kind of clause?
some days those three sports we have my almost attention.
Who
As
knows?
I know that has to imply.
No, there's nothing implied. Scott, where's the, what kind
Dependent.
of? It's a dependent. Where's the subordinate?
Once.
That's right. Now you're going to tell me I don't have once on my list, and you don't. We're going to talk about that. Big picture, what kind of a sentence is that?
Complex.
Complex.
So
You don't have
once
it. You don't
also.
even need to look. It's not there, because the point is this. If you know those 25 words that are on your core list, if some oddball word or phrase functions as a subordinate connective, you ought to be able to pick that out. If this had read, capital O, once I find a gym to play in, you would have been left hanging. If I said to you, in case you didn't get it, in case is acting as a subordinate connective, and that's not on the list either. You don't have every subordinate connective in the world. You don't need it. If you understand how a dependent clause works and you have those 25 core words down and possible variations stemming from them, something odd that crops up like this you ought to be able to find. But big picture, people, if you don't track these clauses, if you don't read them out loud, if you don't mark, here's a subject, here's a verb, you're going to have worse problems with the complex sentence, because this one was fairly easy. And let me just review for you. In the complex sentence, I'll do a really fast review. What do I expect you to know before you even get to the computer? That a complex sentence has one main clause and one or more dependent clauses. I expect you to know that a dependent clause every single time without exception has 3 parts. A subject, a verb, and 100% of the time it begins with a subordinate connective. I expect you to know what subordinate connectives and dependent clauses do. They introduce less important information. And when we get to paragraph and essay writing, they become the key to controlling reader focus. I expect in your sleep that you know if somebody like me were to call you on the phone, all phone numbers present, and say, Yvonne, can you help me? I forgot. What are the subordinate connectives? I would expect you could recite without a problem after, although, as if, because, before, how, if, in order that. You get the picture, and then say, see you tomorrow. You've got to know them that well. How about the rules? Well, 6 of those words, after, as, before, like, since, until, you remember, can be prepositions. We tripped over one today, as well as subordinate connectives. So you have to know that they can go both ways, and you have to have put in the practice time on that. The punctuation rules have to know cold. Dependent clause in front of a main clause, pause, comma. Dependent clause follows a main clause, no pause, no comma. It reflects the way you speak. Dependent clause inside of a main clause, if it's unnecessary, non-restrictive, commas on both sides. But if it's necessary, no commas will be used. How about those 4 funny words, who, which, what, that? They can be subordinate connectives, and pronouns can, not always, but can, double function as subject and subordinate of a dependent clause. Remember, there can be an implied subordinate. I always thought it was that, who, or whom. We found out the other day it could be if as well. Remember that one subordinate connective can make more than one clause dependent. If you start a sentence with a dependent clause, if you add on the next one with one of the fanboys, both clauses are going to be dependent. You'll need to break that chain. A dependent clause, we found, can be the subject of a main clause. 2 subordinates side by side that don't go together can mean 2 dependent clauses, one inside the other. So I'm telling you, you have to have your wits about you when you take this test. Why not ask you to write 1,000 examples of complex sentences on a subject of my choosing? If you can write 10 without error, you could do that 1,000. And if you can't, and you're writing sentences like those we just looked at that applied to the test on the simple sentence, you don't want to write 1,000. Okay, so I'm saying take it seriously and read it carefully before you submit it for a grade. I want to switch gears, and I want to go to fragment errors right now. I want you to go to the Palette book on page 143. And before we start that discussion on fragments, I was waiting for somebody to make a comment about this shirt that I was wearing, because it has a rather unusual Cuban pattern to it. Notice there's a foot. I'm looking to see where that foot is. And just a foot. That's a fragment, isn't it? And we're going to be dealing with fragments right now. If it's a part of a body, and we're going to be looking at a fragment, which is an incomplete part of what could be a sentence, I suppose. Highlight what you need. Fragments are major grammatical errors that academic writers should avoid, and I remind you that a fragment of any type is going to be less than one main clause. A fragment is one major error, the other one is a run-on sentence. Right now we're concentrating on fragments. And I've made a note for you that the most frequent kinds of fragment errors that occur in writing include these 5. The dependent clause fragment, which you know all about. These are 3 new ones. The infinitive phrase fragment, the present or past participle phrase fragment, and terminology counts from today forward. And I figure you know all there is to know also about the last one on the list, the prepositional phrase fragment. Well, we talked about phrases before. We're doing it again now. Remember that phrases can create common fragment errors, and do remember the definition of a phrase as opposed to a clause. It's a group of words that does not contain a complete subject and a complete verb. And I remind you, you should have memorized these diagrams by now, but to see the difference between a clause and a phrase, that's exactly what you have to do. You remember that when you're looking at a clause, it doesn't matter whether it's a main clause or a dependent clause, there's always going to be a complete subject and a complete verb. You just have to look down that column to see that there's at least one subject and one verb in every case. But when you go to the phrase, I remind you that a phrase is always missing something. So it could have a subject and it could have no verb. It could have a subject and only a half verb. Highlight this one. It could have no subject and a half verb. Highlight that one as well. It could have no subject and no verb. So this one, complete subject and a half verb and no subject and a half verb, that's what we're going to find in the verb phrases. And when you're looking at a standard no subject and no verb, that's what you're going to find in a prepositional phrase. But these are the 2 that we're concentrating on now, these verbal phrases. Well, one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that a prepositional phrase always, never mind how it ends, it's always going to start with a preposition. So when you look at with regard to the painting's actual origin, and that happens to be a group preposition with regard to, the prep phrase is always going to start with a preposition. But a verb phrase has 2 ways to go. With a verb phrase, you can have a complete subject and a half verb. That's an example. It necessary to peel back more layers of time. To peel is only a half verb. So that is not a clause. That is a phrase. And it looks like this. As you can see, it has a subject, but it only has a half verb. Or another way to produce a verb phrase is to start with a half verb and to end with a noun or pronoun object. So to investigate earlier generations, that's going to be a half verb, right? But there is no subject because that half verb is followed by a noun object. Well, the first half verb that I want you to master is the infinitive, and that includes the terminology. No longer can you say half verb. Now you have to tell me what kind of a half verb it is. So the infinitive construction is always going to be 2 plus a verb, and here are some examples. To dream, to wonder, to paint. I would highlight it's only a half verb. And an infinitive phrase that stands alone is going to give you a fragment. 2 examples to take a look at. Her husband Stein to survey their living space. As you can see, Stein is a subject, but then you have only this half verb. Actually, the subject is going to be husband. And that's going to give you a fragment that looks like this. Complete subject, but only a half verb. This is also an infinitive phrase. Starts with a half verb, ends with a noun object. It looks like this, no subject and a half verb. But with a capital H on her, a period after space, a capital T, a period, we're looking at 2 different variations of an infinitive phrase fragment. These are not sentences, these are phrases. They are fragments. Well, how do you fix that problem? On page 147 it says, an infinitive phrase will not be a fragment if a helping verb is added to it. So let's look at this example. Her husband Stein, a worker at the Damster Deep Dike, wanted to survey their living space on the 2nd floor of their flooded-out farmhouse, now occupied by food, furniture, a cow, his wife Saskia, and their 2 small children, Marta and Pete. These are going to turn out to be, earlier in time yet, the next owners of that Vermeer painting. So, Farah, where's your first subject?
Husband.
Husband, and how about the verb?
Want to survey.
Wanted to survey, what kind of a clause is it?
Main.
Main. I wonder what kind of a sentence this is. I'll read it to you again. Her husband Stein, a worker at the Damsterdiep dike, wanted to survey their living space on the second floor of their flooded out farmhouse, now occupied by food, furniture, a cow, his wife Saskia, and their two small children, Marta and Pete. So what kind of a sentence is this?
Simple sentence.
It's a simple sentence. You see what happens when the lands are flooded and the windmills don't work quite right? Everybody, including the cow, can you imagine, are all living on the second floor of a very tiny house. Well, here's another way to fix an infinitive phrase fragment. It won't be one if you tack the infinitive phrase onto a main clause. So this example says, to take a closer look at what was floating by on the river below their windowsill, Saskia squeezed behind a grain sack and pointed to a dark-colored object wrapped inside of a blanket. Pippa, where's the subject?
Saskia
And a verb?
squeezed
There's a
and
second verb.
pointed.
Pointed. And I wonder what kind of a clause that is.
Main.
That's a main clause. Can you tell what kind of a sentence we're looking at?
Simple.
I wonder what to take a closer look at is.
What you just put, oh. Prep phrase.
No.
No, verb phrase, infinitive phrase.
All right, that's right. So it's not a simple sentence either. We'll make that correction in a minute. But to followed by a verb is now a half verb that gets a label. As you go through and you mark these phrases now, if it's a prep phrase, just put parentheses around it. But if it's a verb phrase of any kind, let's get a little label that tells us what we're looking at. And INF would be short for infinitive without you writing it out. By the way, on the terminology on infinitive, get the term right. It's not infinity, it's not Star Trek, and it's not a car. It's infinitive. I don't think Pippa's right. I don't think this is a simple sentence. Maritza, do you see another subject?
What?
How about a verb?
Was floating?
And I wonder what kind of a clause that is.
Dependent?
Where would the subordinate be?
At what?
At what? So this is going to be a dependent clause. We actually have a dependent clause coming in front of a main clause. Notice at what is a prep phrase. Double functions as the subordinate connective. We've seen this 3 times today of that dependent clause, and in so doing, again, becomes a variation of what? There's a comma right here, Maritza, after windowsill. Why would that be?
Because the dependent clause is in front of the main clause?
All right, I want to just find out some things. We said to take a closer look was an infinitive phrase. We said at what was part of this dependent clause. What would you call on the river?
Prepositional phrase.
How about below their windowsill?
Prep phrase.
How about behind a grain sack?
Prep phrase.
How about to a dark-colored object?
Prep phrase.
And I'm going to take the easy route at the moment, inside of a blanket.
Another prep phrase.
Right. Actually, it's part of a verb phrase, but we haven't discussed that yet. So we're just seeing that this sentence consists mostly of phrases, but it does turn out to be complex because you have a dependent clause. However, this part, the part that has an infinitive, is not a fragment. Why? Because it's attached to, ultimately, a dependent clause and then another main clause, which is part of a complex sentence. Just to remind you that a sentence is determined by the number and type of clauses it contains and not by phrases. If you had a sentence that had one main clause, one dependent clause, 6 prep phrases, an infinitive phrase, it would all add up to one complex sentence. Well, let's look at some other functions of the infinitive phrase on page 149. It doesn't have to be a verb, it can be a noun modifier. Stein got into his boat and handed up the blanket-covered object, which, when unwrapped, revealed a painting to look at and admire of a beautiful girl looking out of her window. Vince, where's the subject? Stein, I guess, is what we're going to call this man. Stin or Stein. And how about the verb?
Got.
And the other verb? This clause actually has 2 verbs. Handed. And what kind of a clause is that?
Main clause.
It is a main clause. Give me another subject.
Okay.
Give him a hand, Janice. Where's another subject?
Which or when?
It's going to be which, and then what did you say was the verb?
Revealed.
All right, I buy that. And what kind of a clause is that?
Dependent.
Where's the subordinate?
Which.
Okay. Do you see any other clauses?
When.
Anybody see any other clauses? Anybody? You're very sharp. This would have been a temptation, but it's not, because when might be a subordinate, unwrapped might be a verb. You don't have the third part, which is a subject. So we just have one main clause, one dependent clause, which gives us what kind of a sentence?
Complex.
Complex. But I want to look at and admire. I just want to look at and admire. Let's stop it there. What would that be, to look at and admire? A painting to look at and admire.
Are you asking me?
Mm-hmm.
Infinitive.
Right, it's really here. That's an infinitive phrase with a subject and two half verbs. A painting to look at and admire. It's not a fragment, is it? Because it's attached to that dependent clause, part of this complex sentence. Well, here's something else that can happen with an infinitive. An infinitive phrase can be a subject in a clause. To savor the mystery of this ownerless painting was to momentarily lose sight of the second God-given object in the boat, which was a basket containing a newborn baby wrapped in its mother's shawl, together with a cabbage leaf for good luck. Maritza, let's give it a shot. Where is, I'll take anything you see. I'll let you lead me through this. I think I'd start with a verb.
Was.
And if it's was, I think you've got more in that verb.
Was to lose.
Was to lose. Now, where's the subject that goes with that?
To savor the mysteries of this.
Right there. Stop there. And that gives you what kind of a clause?
That's a main clause.
See, we could just say this: to savor the mystery was to lose sight. We could just have that part of it. Now, there's another subject.
Which
And a verb?
was
And the kind of clause.
dependent.
Where's the subordinate?
Which
So how many main clauses do we have?
one.
And how many dependent?
One.
And it's what kind of a sentence?
Complex.
Now, to savor the mystery, no question about it, is the subject of this main clause. What else is it?
It's also an infinitive.
It's also an infinitive phrase that takes that subject position. Now, would that surprise you? No. Because remember, a couple of weeks ago, we found out that a prepositional phrase could act as a subject. What's your favorite movie? On the Town Is. And a lecture or so ago, we found that a whole dependent clause could act as a subject. That I said it is true. Well, if you can have a prepositional phrase acting as the subject of a clause and a dependent clause acting as the subject of a clause, why couldn't you have an infinitive phrase acting as the subject of a clause? And the answer is, of course, you can. Questions? Let's try the participles. And these are the other half verbs. On page 151, I would highlight selectively what you need to know. A participle phrase standing alone creates a fragment, and a participle phrase has an incomplete verb. Now here's some good news. When a participle is written in the present tense, it will end in ing. 100% of the time, that's a rare thing to say. When a participle is written in the past tense, the regular ending will be ed, but I want you to star this past tense. And I want you to make a note. Ed can be the regular ending for a whole verb, but right now we're looking at half verbs or a half verb. That's a problem with the past participle ending. Ed is the regular ending. And there's a problem with this ing ending on the present tense, the present participle. It's always going to be ing. That's the good news. The bad news is all words that end in ing aren't verbs. And if they're not verbs, you're not dealing with a present participle. If you take the word running, R-U-N-N-I-N-G, and you say running is fun, then running is the subject, a gerund if you like. If you say you have hot and cold running water at home, then hot, cold, running are adjectives. They describe the water. If you say the boy is running down the street, now it's in verb position. If you say the boy running down the street, period, then you're going to have a present participle phrase fragment. So watch out. Also, on your list of prepositions that you memorized and that you're reviewing every day, the word during comes to mind, ends in ing, never going to be a verb, always going to be a preposition. Okay? Now here's the thing. Past participles, although that ed ending is the regular one, a lot of them in English have an irregular ending. Now, at least once in the past, major person tried to regularize that and went from catch to catched. And that major person is Shakespeare. Who's Shakespeare, Pippa?
Shakespeare is a playwright that began in the 1500s in England and wrote a whole series of excellent
I wonder how
plays.
many.
Oh God, 37.
Name some titles for us.
Twelfth Night, Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's
That would do
Dream.
it. And one of the ones that you saw that you didn't like, as a matter of
Julius
fact.
Caesar.
No. Yes, you recently saw that, but a little earlier, Love's Labor's Lost. That was turned into a movie a year or two ago with Kenneth Branagh, who is one of my favorites. Tap dancing, can you imagine? But, and then maybe that's why it didn't work, because it was turned into a musical and a tap dancing musical at that, so a lot of people didn't like it. But in that play, Love's Labor's Lost, there is a character who says, catch in the present and catched when he moves to the past. That's what it should be. But the problem is that when English imported verbs from other countries, it also imported the way the other country did the verb tense change. So if you get a verb like ring, coming from Germany, and you go through tense changes, this is what you get. Ring for the present, rang for the past, rung for the past participle. There's no ed in sight. Those tense changes are manifested by the internal vowel. I means present. A means past. You in this case means have. So in terms of past participles, this is just a little sample of irregular endings that you're going to find. And I want to walk you through this sample. And I want to remind you that the odd thing is every single past participle is going to end in ing. It's the past participle that's going to have the irregular ending. And I want to start with a regular one. Should end in ed. So if you take something like walk, walking, walked, it does. But how about make, making, made, or catch, catching, surely caught, not catched, or hold, holding, held, or break, breaking, broken, or send, sending, sent, not I sended a letter to you, that's not going to be right, or sew with the needle thread, sewing, sewn. I like this one, fit, fitting, fit, because it has two past participles. First of all, the present and the past participle are identical, fit and fit. But it has another one, fitted, and you got to use the right one at the right time. If you say yesterday I was fit to be tied, it's got to be fit and it means angry. If you say today I will be fitted for a new pair of shoes, it's got to be fitted and it has a totally different meaning. Here's one, sell, selling, sold. That's irregular. Come, coming, come. And here's one that has always puzzled me. Go, going, gone. It's like do, doing, done. But if it's done, why isn't it gone? Or if it's go, going, gone, why isn't it do, doing, dawn? I don't have an answer. I simply raise that as a question. Here's another one. Tear, tearing, torn. Now here's one that Pippa actually used to do this when she was a child growing up, because a child learns to speak by listening to adults, not by reading. We're talking about preschoolers, not by writing. And Pippa was famous for saying things like, I losted my money. And some of you write that way, and you say, it costed too much. The child's logical. There is an ed ending. The language isn't logical. Here's another one. Sometimes before we go to another ending, ed is past, right? But a child doesn't hear the ed, so the child says, I misted you. Mist already has an ed. Child doesn't hear it. Adds another one to be sure. I misted you. Logically, it's right. Grammatically, it's wrong. Find, finding, found. This is a different kind of sow. This is throw some corn seeds in the backyard and grow some corn on the cob. Sow, sowing, sown. How about this one? Swim, swimming, swum, and it is swum. Or ring, ringing, rung. Or drink, drinking, drunk. Not drank. I have drank a glass of water this morning. It's not going to work that way. And here's another odd one, cut, cutting, cut. Well, you know, it's like this. It's like put, pudding, put. But if it's put, why isn't it could? Don't know. And if it's cut, cutting, cut, wouldn't you think that it could be put? Well, there is a verb, put, but it has two T's and it relates to golf and not to anything that we're talking about right now. So you have to develop an eye to recognize an irregular past participle when you see one. Notice that a participle phrase can have a subject and a participle. So if you look at this one, Saskia looking for some clues about the baby boy's parents. Ben, the subject is? Saskia. And the verb? Looking. Whole verb, half verb?
Whole verb.
Whole verb. Then this must be some kind of a sentence.
A fragment.
If it's a fragment, do you have a whole verb? Do you have a half verb?
Okay, then it'll be a half verb.
You have a half verb. What kind of a half verb is it?
Present participle.
Exactly. So this is going to be a PRP frag, make a note, short for present participle phrase fragment without you having to write out all those words. Notice it has a complete subject, it has only a half verb, and that ing ending is the clue that you're looking at a present participle. How about this one? A message written on one side of an art document held in place by a fold in the mother's shawl, urging the reader of the note to sell the painting and feed the child. Scott, where's the subject?
Message,
And how about a verb?
written and held,
Are those whole verbs or half verbs?
half verbs.
Now, actually, there are other half verbs here, aren't there? I'm particularly interested in those, but there are other half verbs in this. Where?
Urging,
That's one. And there's still another one. Anybody see it?
To sell?
To sell
and feed.
and feed, because it's to sell and to feed, exactly. So these are both going to be half verbs. Well, it doesn't look like it could be a sentence. What are you going to call it?
A past participle phrase fragment.
All right, it's a toss-up. You could flip a coin on this one. Label it for the moment double P, frag. But we could have easily called it a PRP frag or an INF frag because it's got a whole slew of half verbs, if you like. Now, a participle phrase, here's another way to produce one, can have a participle and no subject. So look at this one. Remembering a man rowing under the window and asking for some milk. Yvonne, do you see a subject?
No.
What about a verb?
Remembering,
And?
growing,
And?
asking.
And doesn't look like a sentence. What kind of a fragment is it going to be?
PRP, present.
A PRP frag. 3 half verbs in a row. Looks like this. It doesn't have a subject. It does have a half verb.
I was tempted to say man was the subject, but man is the object of the first verb phrase, so
Right, remembering a
that
man
can't
would
be
be
a
a
subject.
participle phrase, right? The object. How about this? Stunned by the thought. Janice, where's the subject?
Implied you
An
or
implied what?
well, I don't know.
Do I have to retell you the story of the Emperor's New Clothes?
No.
No, please.
Did I tell you that story one time? At the end of the Emperor's New Clothes, you remember that 10-year-old looks at the Emperor and says, what? You don't remember that story and I told you?
I remember. I just don't remember what the kid said.
What was the pitch line? What did the child say? Here's that emperor always wanting new clothes, and the tailor weaves the cloth and makes the clothing, and the emperor keeps saying, well, what cloth? And all the people, when he marches down the main street of town, say, I've never seen a suit like that. And the 10-year-old child says, what, Maritza?
He's not wearing nothing.
He's not wearing anything.
Anything.
Actually, anything. So in Stunned by the Thought, Janice, I must be making a point, where's the subject?
There is no subject.
No subject. Where's the verb?
Stunned.
A whole verb or half verb?
Half.
So this whole thing is what?
A past participle fragment.
Right, and we would just do double P, frag. Well, we're going to fix those fragments. A participle phrase will not be a fragment if you add a helping verb to it, and Pippa has a question.
Okay. Why wouldn't it be implied you?
Because this isn't a command. Can you say, you, stunned by the thought?
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's try this next example.
That's a good one.
Saskia was looking for some clues about the baby boy's parents. Pippa, where's the subject? How
Saskia,
about a verb?
was looking.
Type of clause.
Main,
Type of sentence.
simple.
No longer a fragment, you see? Because was is added to that participle, giving us a whole verb. Let's try this one. A message was written on one side of an art document held in place by a fold in the mother's shawl, urging the reader of the note to sell the painting and feed the child. Scott, where's the subject?
Message.
How about a verb?
Was written.
And the kind of clause,
Main.
kind of sentence.
Simple.
So all we did here was to add a helping verb, and now it's a sentence. It's not a fragment. Here's another way to fix that kind of error. A participle phrase will not be a fragment if you tack it on to a main clause. Remembering a man rowing under the window and asking for some milk, she wondered if the baby had been his. Scott, where's your subject?
She
How about a verb?
wondered.
And the kind of clause.
Main.
Where's another subject?
Baby.
And the verb?
Had been.
And the kind of clause.
Dependent.
And the subordinate.
If.
So what would you call, we're going to start to look at flip-flop patterns right now, asking for some milk? Anybody have an idea on that one? Yvonne?
Present participle with the prep acting as its object.
Exactly. And on these verb phrases, remember, you're going to give them a label, and we're going to start seeing flip-flop patterns. We're moving our way into that right now. That whole thing would be a present participle phrase that starts with a present participle and ends with a prepositional phrase, acting as the object. What would you say to this, Yvonne, remembering a man?
Present participle.
So that's another PRP. What would you say rowing under the window was?
Present participle with a prep acting as object.
So here's an addition problem. I have a main clause, a dependent clause, and 3 present participle phrases, and it gives me what?
Complex sentence.
A complex sentence. Note the punctuation, a comma. It works just like the complex sentence. You know how in a complex sentence, if you have a dependent clause in front of the main clause, you get a pause, you get a comma. If you have a phrase, phrases if you like, in front of a clause, don't care what kind of phrase, don't care what kind of clause, you're going to get a pause, you're going to get a comma. Let's try one more. Stunned by the thought of anyone abandoning a child, she turned the art document over, saw the name Jan, the maker of the painting, and decided to call the nameless baby Little Jan or Janche to link the baby's present to his past. Okay, Scott, take it away. Where's the subject?
She.
She. And how about your verb?
Turned, saw,
Yeah.
decided to call.
Turned, saw, decided to call. Type of clause.
Main.
Do we have anything else to worry about?
Negative.
So this is what kind of a sentence?
Simple.
A simple sentence. What is this? Stunned by the thought?
Past participle phrase.
Past participle phrase. How about of anyone?
Present.
How
A
about
prepositional phrase.
prepositional phrase? Abandoning a child?
Present participle
Present
phrase.
participle. How about of the painting?
That would be a prepositional.
How about to link the baby's present?
Infinitive.
Infinitive. How about to his past?
Be prepositional.
And the whole thing is not a fragment because we've added all those verb phrases and the prep phrase to that main clause to form a simple sentence. Yes, question, Janice.
If it were you were stunned by the thought,
Sure.
would that just be a regular sentence?
Yes. You were stunned by the thought
Yes.
of not having anything to eat today. Yes, but it wouldn't be a command. It wouldn't be a command. Anybody else with a question? Do a brilliant job on your test on the complex sentence, please. And a word to the wise, track your clauses, read out loud, check very carefully to see what you've done. Okay? Anybody with a question?
Are you going to give us our
Yes, I am. I don't need them anymore. They're coming back to you right now.